Okay, so picking up where we left off, looking at Roman numerals 3 and 4 in the Islamic world and its growth. So, where we last talked about, we were looking at how Islam had grown and established caliphates and how it affected women and everyday people. So, now we're going to look at how Islam affects specific areas of the world. All right, we're going to look at 4 different aspects. I held up 3 fingers. How it affects India, how it affects West Africa, how it affects Spain, and how it affects what's called Anatolia or the Middle East. Okay? Or not the Middle East, excuse me, modern day Turkey. You can't talk today. So let's check this out. All right, let's start with India first. So Islam is going to be spread into India via what we call Turkish invaders. So these are people that lived in Central Asia. They were nomadic. And these Turkish invaders are going to spread Islam into India via conquest, right? So they're going to take areas over. They're going to establish a Muslim-style kingdom in northern India. That's called the Sultanate of Delhi, Delhi being like the city. So the Sultanate of Delhi, for the next 100, 200 years is going to have Muslim rule over parts of what we call modern day India. All right. And so what actually happens is that Islam is going to appeal to people in India similar to how Buddhism had appealed to people under Hinduism. So if you remember, we've got the caste system under Hinduism in India. Remember, Buddhism's gone. And under Hinduism, your lowest castes are treated the worst. They have no respect in society. Islam is another religion that doesn't matter your social status. You can be rich, poor, whatever. You can still have success and still be able to go to heaven under the Islamic faith. So Islam is going to appeal to people in the lower rungs of society, lower castes. And especially those Sufis, those Sufi mystics are going to popularize Islam there. The reason why is that under Hinduism, there are a lot of practices, and they call these like Hindi, like holy men, and they're people that are kind of like the Sufi mystics in Islam were, where they don't really participate in society, and they practice like their own kind of rituals, and they Sufi mystics do those like songs and chants like we talked about. And so there's going to kind of be that Sufi gateway into India is how it's going to help make Islam more popular there, especially in the northern parts of India. So Islam is strongest in North and Northwest India, but there is a growing cultural divide that will establish between Muslims and Hindus. Islam is very rigid in terms of, the one God structure. In Islam, they don't have any kinds of representations of Allah, their God, of, like a statue or even like showing face or anything like that. Meanwhile, in Hinduism, there's like hundreds of gods. They all have all sorts of different statues and ways that they approach it. So at some points, there's going to be some give and take there that has to happen, but it's going to cause a lot of conflict eventually. We're going to talk about a group that takes this area over of Muslims that will establish what's called the Mughal Empire. And the Mughals are going to have some big implications in our next couple units. What you do see in India, one of the long-standing trends is another blend. So we use that word syncretism, a syncretic blend, what's called Sikhism. It blends Islam and Hinduism, and part of that is that Sufi idea. It's established by Guru Nanak in that 15th century time frame. And the Sikhs are going to play a role later on, especially when the British show up and colonize India. So we'll be making some references there soon as well. But understand Sikhism now as kind of being that Sufi mystic, Islamic, and Hindu blend, happy marriage, so to speak, of those two. Right? Happy, whatever. So that is kind of how India is affected by Islam, also known as South Asia. Okay, let's talk about what's called Anatolia. So Anatolia is what you think of as modern-day Turkey. So we're looking at Eastern Mediterranean here. And at the time of this, Anatolia was, this area was ruled by a Christian kingdom called the Byzantines. We said the Byzantine Empire were the holdovers from ancient Rome. And what's going to happen is, just like you have Turkish invaders that go to India, you have Turkish invaders that go into Anatolia here and basically eradicate the Byzantines, take everything over. Now, because the Byzantines were Christian, and they were monotheistic. It makes it easier for people to convert to Islam because of the similarities there. It's a monotheistic faith. There's a lot of overlap in some of their basic ideas. And so that monotheistic heritage makes it easier for assimilation into this growing Muslim empire. And that's really what they're going to establish, because the Muslim population is going to grow significantly. And by 1500, 9 out of 10 people, 90%, are going to be Muslim. And this is going to be a very prominent empire we're going to talk about in the next several units, called the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans are a big deal when it comes to world history. Ottoman Empire exists until World War I. So very long-standing Islamic empire and presence in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean as a result. And it is the largest empire in the world from an Islamic sense at that point. So we see 2 instances of invasion and establishment of Islamic rule in areas. Let's talk about West Africa. Now, it's going to be a lot different in terms of how Islam affects West Africa. So essentially, one of the things we've talked about are trade networks, right? And we talked trade networks in the Indian Ocean, and we talked about the Silk Road that goes from China to the Middle East. So there's another trade network across across Africa, particularly. We call it the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. And so a lot of trade is going to happen across this. And what you're going to see is the impact of Muslim merchants as a result. So we know that some of these ports are parts of Indian Ocean trade, right? Indian Ocean being out over here. And so there's also trade basically via land across the Sahara Desert and towards West Africa. And so that is how Islam is going to enter these areas. You've got Muslim merchants via trade, because remember, merchants going to make a lot of money, and Islamic scholars that are going to bring this religion more peacefully. So this is not by sword. And this is how in West Africa they're going to establish a connection to the outside world. So this is really important when we're looking at why does Islam take hold in West Africa? Because it gives the urban centers, your very heavily populated areas, a connection to other larger empires and areas, so to speak. And so this is how. Remember, in Islam, it's easy to trade with someone else that is Muslim too, right? So that makes that process a lot easier. You're part of that brotherhood. You're going to want to trade with someone that is the same religion as you. Same process happens here. But it's going to be the urban centers. It's not really the rural populations in West Africa. So the everyday person that doesn't really live in these established cities, they're not really converting to Islam. It's mostly going to be the elites, the rulers, the scholars, the wealthier classes that convert to Islam because they're influenced by trade. They're influenced by the reading and writing. And it is also interesting to note because literacy is promoted by Islam as well, right? You need to read the Quran, so Islamic scholars, okay? One of the most prominent urban centers at this time is called Timbuktu. Now, sometimes you may have heard that term, like as far away as Timbuktu. Timbuktu is a real place. It's in West Africa, modern-day Mali area. And Timbuktu becomes a giant urban center, especially because of the prominence of one specific person that we'll talk about, Mansa Musa. All right, I'm a huge fan of Mansa Musa. You need to know Mansa Musa for world history. Arguably speaking, the world's wealthiest person. Mansa Musa was so wealthy that he actually, by giving away so much money in some areas, completely changed their economies and upended it all. What Mansa Musa did was he was a West African king that he is Muslim, and so he's going to complete that Hajj. Remember, the Hajj is your pilgrimage that you need to make at some point in your life to Mecca. So on the way, Mansa Musa helps kind of spread this myth of all this gold in West Africa, because this man travels with the biggest caravan sometimes the world's really ever seen. There's so much to talk about with Mansa Musa. Very interesting. What you need to do is you need to watch this video that I'll have linked on your weekly calendar, and you should be able to click on it here. It's about 3 minutes. It's well done. It's not boring. But it's so helpful in explaining Mansa Musa a lot more. You really want to know a lot about him. He's a great example of a prominent West African figure. Too much in world history, we get very Eurocentric because, most of that history was written by Europe, and we don't give the proper look at African civilizations, because they say, the Eurocentric view was they weren't civilized. They didn't write things down. They did things different ways. But here, example of Mansa Musa is one of one of the really the richest people to ever exist, and a really interesting person to check out. So make sure to watch that. It's only about 3 minutes. It's worth it. All right. So lastly, let's talk about Islam and how it impacts Spain. So we talked about Spain, also known as the Iberian Peninsula. So when Arabs and what's another group called Berbers, who are all Muslim, as they go across North Africa, they're eventually going to invade Spain. And they'll take over this area and they'll call it Al-Andalus. All right. Now, what they'll do is they'll establish their own small caliphate. Remember, caliphate's basically a Muslim term for a kingdom, centered at a city called Cordoba. And Cordoba grows and prospers for the next several hundred years. And by 1000 CE, it becomes a huge, thriving metropolis. It's got centers of learning. There's tons of Islamic universities. People come from far and wide to access their libraries, their texts. So it becomes this really stronghold for the Islamic world there in Spain. Now, as Islamic prosperity grows, there's also worries by the Christian kings in Europe at this time. So, quick recap of what this looks like. We're talking about Al-Andalus, Iberian Peninsula, that's Spain here, right? And so there are European kings that start to get a little wary of this growing Islamic threat here. Remember, of course, people always fear what they don't know, different religions, etc., right? And so over time, there starts to be conflict between these two groups. So these Christian kings are starting to fight with the Islamic caliphs and the caliphate there, and it starts to actually lead to a lot of persecution of Christians in Cordoba. Like this area early on, though, is like other Muslim-controlled areas we talked about, religiously tolerant. You pay your tax, you're fine. You could be Jewish or Christian as long as you paid your tax. You can practice your faith, whatever. So eventually, by 1492, these fights continue on, these wars, these constant battles. And by 1492, Christian kings have restored Christian control over all of this area, over all of Spain. It's called the Reconquista. Think conquer. Reconquista, you're on the right track. By 1492, the Alhambra, which is one of the largest Muslim fortresses, it's supposed to be really beautiful. The architecture is amazing. Falls by that point. And so Muslim rule is essentially gone from Spain. And what these Christian kings do, and you might have heard of these people before, Ferdinand and Isabella of the Columbus voyages, Ferdinand and Isabella, they will kick out a ton of Muslims, force them to leave. Some Muslims can stay, but they have more restrictions on them. And another interesting thing, they kick out all the almost the entirety of the Jewish population. The Jewish population in medieval Europe had already been persecuted, and the Hebrews, the Jews, as we talked about before, have pretty much been persecuted oftentimes as well throughout world history. So one of the other interesting things to note, one of the reasons why Ferdinand and Isabella can fund those voyages of Columbus to the New World is because of all the stuff they got when they kicked out all these Muslims and Jews from the spoils of war. So Columbus's voyages were more or less fueled by blood money. Probably another reason why we may not be so happy towards Columbus. But either way, so that's another way that Islam influenced an area by conquering and then eventually by establishing centers of learning in Spain, or Al-Andalus. All right, lastly, real quick, talk about how Islam impacts the world in terms of some of its contributions. So one of the things we look at is how the Islamic scholars spend a lot of time looking through the Quran and creating those hadiths like we talked about, those interpretations of the Quran. Those scholars, they're called ulamas, and a lot of them will be doing their learning in these Muslim-style religious universities called madrasas. And it's in these madrasas that they're coming up, that all these ulamas, these scholars, are getting together, and they are interpreting the Quran, creating hadiths, and they're there, and by creating those Sharia, those religious laws, then they're influencing the laws of everyone. It's going to be merchants that link Afro-Eurasia, and it's Islamic culture that's doing that. So a lot of these merchants are going to practice Islam because merchants there's no negative connotation. There's no negative outcome to being a merchant in Islam. In fact, they promote it. You can be wealthy as long as you're doing one of your one of your 5 pillars of Islam: almsgiving, giving to the poor. So if you're wealthy and you're looking after others as a wealthy merchant, but you give to the community, that's cool. You're doing the right thing. So it's merchants that are going to tie all this together. Trade makes world history go round. There is a Islamic green revolution where they're going to increase food production, and as a result, then you have a higher population. When you can feed more people, they'll have more babies. That's the basics of world history. So essentially, when we're talking about this, they'll improve some of the basic food production, but they're also going to revolutionize some more desirable foodstuffs like sugar. Remember, we talked about West Africa and the slave trade that originates. That's because of the desire for slave labor in the Islamic world. Remember, Muslims won't make slaves of Jews or Christians, so they have to find other non-religious groups, whether they're not Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, and that's where the earliest instances of the African slave trade come from, for that sugar production. And it's those trade networks like the Trans-Saharan Network that we'll talk more about in your next unit that are important. And finally, the last thing we need to emphasize is that one of the biggest contributions to world history is that the Arab world, the Islamic world, kept all the Greek and Roman texts that had been lost. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which you've heard about before, once those civilizations went away, in Europe, they lost all of that. It's mostly gone. And so one of the ways that we have that rebirth, that renaissance in Europe in the 1500s and 1400s is because of access to those ancient Greek and Roman texts that the Islamic world had held on to, that they had translated into Arabic. So when Ferdinand and Isabella and those Christian kings take over Spain again with the Reconquista, then they find all these Islamic texts in Cordoba that have those ancient Greek and Roman findings in them. So they're able to build upon them. That's how they create algebra and other things in the Islamic world, and then Europe builds off that. So you can't discount that contribution. They're holding on to some of that lost findings, so to speak, that help with the whole Renaissance in Europe later on. Okay, that's chapter 9. The Islamic world, also referred to as Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. So we'll continue on looking at chapter 10, Europe, soon. Thanks. See ya.